And we will continue. Hello, Tara Kelly.
Yes.
Tara
Hi.
Kelly hi, is another guest of ours. She will be speaking about the very interesting presentation that is called in the program Making Lemonade Out of Lemons, Stories of Media Resilience in the Face of COVID. And she will also have a short presentation at the beginning. But at first, I would really like to introduce Tara briefly. Tara is from European Journalism Center. She is a data editor for the European Journalism Center. She commissions and edits long-form articles for datajournalism.com and is the host of the Conversations with Data podcast. Previously, she worked as a journalist for the Huffington Post, Time Magazine, and CNN International. Her articles have appeared in the Financial Times magazine, Pointer.org, and France 24.com. She has experience in digital production, broadcasting, editing, writing, and data storytelling. And we are really looking forward to your presentation. Tara, floor is yours.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Alice. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the stories of resilience in the face of COVID-19 today. As she said, I'm from the European Journalism Center, and through that project, we actually launched a project called the Resilience Reports. And from June to September, I interviewed 24 news organizations across Europe from 19 different countries. And this was supported by the Evans Foundation as well. So this was sort of a really interesting project that I got to work on here's just some examples of the published articles. So these were in-depth case studies, hour-long, 2-hour-long interviews sometimes, really just trying to showcase and find out how news organizations were digging in and trying to report on COVID, but also adapt to it in a business sense and its operations. But I'll focus mainly on the editorial innovation that came out of COVID-19. So first, let's turn to the case study, Istinomer in Serbia. They're mainly focused on fact-checking. They're actually a political fact-checking news organization. They've been around since 2009, and the pandemic really presented an interesting opportunity for them because there was so much misinformation, but they also had an election to deal with. And that was more of their focus initially, but the pandemic changed that. It meant they had to sort of find out factually what was happening, and the response holds public officials to account and how they were actually combating and fighting against the coronavirus. And at the same time, they were also fact-checking statements from politicians since it was an election, and the election was also pushed back from April to June. And that meant that it just presented a lot of opportunity, but also a lot of work for this small team of just 7. So one of the innovations that came out of this was they came up with a browser extension called Proveri Me, which in Serbian means fact check me. And this allows readers to actually connect directly with the Istinomer team of journalists with just one click. So say they see an article that they're not sure about and they want it to be fact checked. They just click on a button and that notification gets sent to the team. They fact check it and then a notification gets sent back. So this is something that saved them time. It saved the journalist time, but it also provided a much more streamlined way to connect with its audience and also efficiently fact check lots of misinformation that was coming out from the pandemic. And this was funded, it was a Facebook initiative funded by Fact Checking Innovation Initiative. So that's just one example that we saw coming out. The next case study I just wanted to highlight, this is something that might be close to many of your hearts, Magazín Reportér. I think in my reporting, I called it Reporter Magazine, so I apologize for that. But in Czech Republic, if you haven't heard of this magazine, it's a brilliant magazine that kind of is almost like the New Yorker or the Atlantic. And they did a lot of innovation around, they basically launched a new subscription model and also a crowdfunding campaign that was very successful. So here's the article. We have our readers behind us, how Reporter Magazine sought to turn casual readers into paying subscribers. And so, apologies. This is a Prague-based monthly magazine that really, when COVID hit, they really struggled because financially the tourism industry just was decimated during the first wave of COVID. And this meant that they lost a lot of advertising from, the travel sector, essentially. So what they had to do was pivot and be nimble. And basically they launched several initiatives, but these are the two I thought were most interesting. They came up with this new subscription model where it was actually just another tier, but it provided in-depth interviews that they were doing every weekday. And this was really interesting because they interviewed COVID experts. They interviewed the way people were dealing with COVID, and they also they had non-COVID stuff because it was a lot of readers actually didn't want to read about COVID all the time. So that was something very interesting. And they also launched a very successful crowdfunding campaign to fund this subscription. And they really called that to their readers and said, guys, we really want, your help. We've just, half of their funding came from advertising and the other half normally came from subscriptions. So they boosted their subscriptions through this. And they aimed to raise 14,000 and they raised 43,000 the last time I spoke to him. So 43,000 euros. And they never thought that their readers would come out and support them in that way. I mean, they knew that they had a good relationship with them, but they didn't know exactly, how much these people would really back them. So I think that that's an excellent example of just, taking what you have and trying to work with it. And another thing that they did, they pivoted editorially. They had a reporter who was based in Iran covering the election there, but then they quickly realized, oh, the story has changed. It's about COVID and how the Iranian government is handling this or not handling this. They really had a wider scope about the pandemic, and they could provide coverage that no one else could provide in Czech. So they also, subsequent months, they looked at the impact of COVID on people in Prague and elsewhere around the country. And they also did something around, the changing face of Prague long-term because of the tourism sector collapsing. What would this mean for the city? So they were finding that wider angle, which I thought was very interesting. And just, this is the quote from the senior editor, Mikhail Musil, who basically said, they didn't sit and wait around to find out what was going to happen. They acted, and that was something that they learned from the 2008 financial crisis. And this crowdfunding campaign really helped them because they offered lots of different things like, T-shirts, signed books, experiences with journalists, yoga sessions. They were really thinking, what can we offer our audience? And by offering these 30 different packages, that's how they got that 43,000. So they took what they had and they tried to work with it. Now let's move on to Switzerland. Now, Heidi.news, I don't know if you've heard of them, but they are a new news organization that launched in May 2019. And they really did a lot of innovation and really looked at how they could serve their readers in Geneva. They're mainly targeting the Francophone Swiss community, which is about 1.5 million people. And they've won a lot of awards. They haven't been around for long. They initially focused really on health and science and education, and then they expanded later after COVID, but to education and culture. So during the first wave of COVID-19, they had to rethink and reshape their editorial strategy, and they had to expand their coverage, but they also had to surprise their audience. And I think they doubled their readers and they doubled subscribers, and they also doubled the amount of coverage and articles that they were coming out. And one of the things I think that was really interesting about them was they came up with this idea of almost like the way we binge on Netflix, we should binge on journalism. So they launched this thing called Explorations. And basically they had this actually before the pandemic, but they focused on pandemic issues like 72 hours on the coronavirus front lines inside a university hospital in Lausanne. And that was, a number of different episodes, so to speak, where you're listening to and really finding out what's happening. They did another one on Milan in the time of coronavirus, another one on the mask market. and why the cost of masks were going up and what this meant. So they also previously looked at stuff like digital addiction, or how some Swiss people were waiting for the end of the world. So it's like, it's a new concept of episodic journalism that they were working on. And they really surprised their audience by coming up with different interviews, by launching 2 new newsletters that focused on COVID. They did Q&As. They were just really, when I think of R&D for journalism, I think of them. And and the fact that they're expanding now into business and culture, because people are tired of health and science. They still want to find out about it, but they want to read other stuff too. So I think that was a perfect example right there. And then finally, Solomon Magazine. This was probably one of my favorites. A bit of a tearjerker, I'm going to warn you, but it's all about elevating the voices of refugees and migrants during COVID-19. And Solomon Magazine, they're a media collective based in Athens, founded by actually 2 friends. One is a Greek journalist and the other was an Afghan. I'm not sure if he's a migrant or a refugee, but living in Greece. Still doesn't have any settled status there. But they used this opportunity, even though they lost a lot and they were worried about their financials, they redesigned their website. They had to let go quite a few people, but they also knew that they could provide stories that other news organizations couldn't, because they could tap into the refugee and migrant community with WhatsApp interviews, trying to find out what was going on in a refugee camp with 40,000 people, who are struggling. How can you social distance in a refugee camp, for instance? So they really tapped into the living conditions of what migrant workers were experiencing in the center of the country. And they really focused on that underreported or often forgotten community. And it was written, for them, but also to inform the international community and other organizations about what's really happening. And shining a light in where no one else is. So they had that, and they published in English as well as Greek. Some of the articles were Greek only, some of them were English only, but I think they tried to do both languages where possible. So I thought that was a brilliant, and they've also launched a new campaign on Kickstarter, and they raised loads of money that way too. So that's just an example of some resilience. And by the way, we do have a final report coming out, sort of summarizing the key findings and suggestions and recommendations for this resilience report. So that's really, a bit of an overview.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We are now having Q&A with me, so I hope that also other people from the audience will join us for this Q&A section. And I have, of course, the question for you regarding your presentation, since I know that you have been interviewing many people since the beginning of the year. I wanted to ask you, you have showed us very positive examples, but there were also crowdfunding campaigns that didn't work. Could you say what is important for the crowdfunding campaign of any medium to succeed?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you've got to know your audience and you've got to tap into what they want. You can't go after what advertisers want. You can't go after the clickbait. You've got to think, what does my audience want? What do they need? What's of interest to them? And what stories can I tell that no one else is telling? And I think once you have that, like you need some connection with your audience already, even if it's a small connection. And then once you sort of have shown that you're doing something that no one else can, I think then that's the moment to launch the crowdfunding campaign. And it's not always going to be a success, but I think it's about communication. And from what the people I spoke to who were successful, they really explained, what it took to tell these stories and why people needed to pay for news, and what it meant for them, and why it's really, you have to pay for this kind of work. It's not going to just be free all the time. And so I think that's one way that people communicated about paywalls that I think you can kind of also replicate with for these independent news organizations with your crowdfunding, explain that things cost money, how much resource, be transparent and show the reality of your situation. And, giving people the option to sort of donate in a flexible way, maybe make a one-off donation or maybe continually donate every month. I think that flexibility is also really important. But I think with El Dario and the local, El Dario was in Spain and they were one news organization, and they really did a lot with, explaining to the messaging, and thinking, how do we talk to our audience and make them understand what we're going through and that we might go under, and if they value you, I think if you build it, they will come, so to speak.
When I was reading an article from you exactly about that Hungarian case, that the issue that they really tried to forecast and not just visualize the troubles with COVID-19. There was an important point and issue raised that in Hungary there weren't trustworthy enough information about COVID epidemic or pandemics. Is it comparable to some other country you were also covering this situation when the media are in fact playing the role of the information source that is much more trustworthy than the governmental one? I'm sorry.
I think we saw that in Serbia, where it was actually the numbers were not reported correctly, and it was another news outlet outside of Serbia that found out that the numbers were not matching up, and someone had leaked that to, like a medical profession in Serbia had leaked that outside to someone, and then it came out, and so Istinomer, I think, felt compelled to actually come out and say this is not factual. So yeah, I think you were seeing across. I'm not sure if Bulgaria was doing that. I think they were more just corrupt and, not following the rules, so to speak, and not being very transparent. But yeah, no, I think that, yeah, Serbia was definitely one of those countries. Poland a little bit. It was funny because when I interviewed them, the Poles would be like, we're not as bad as Hungary. And then the Serbs would be like, well, yeah, we're almost as bad as Poland, but we're not there yet. And same with Reporter magazine. It was like, we're not as bad as Poland or Hungary. So they were all kind of comparing each other around press freedom and what they could trust from the government. So I think in this region, everyone was kind of struggling a little bit. But yeah, Serbia and Hungary, I think, were the two red flags. In Hungary, 90% of the media is controlled by the government somehow. So that, and you've seen press freedom across those different countries I just mentioned drop since 2013. And it's becoming very worrying. And yeah, I think you're seeing that a lot. And I mean, and in Poland, I know one of the things that Oko Press, an investigative news outlet there, was saying was that they were worried, that they covered how people were concerned that the government might use COVID-19 to curb their freedom. So this was sort of an ongoing theme in the region, I saw.
Thank you. We have the question from the audience. You profiled today mainly smaller, probably more agile organizations. Did you see much innovation among bigger traditional media?
So we purposefully decided not to cover those larger media organizations like legacy media, just because we wanted to give coverage to these other organizations that were, not necessarily going to get that PR, so to speak, or not get that. And this was also a great, thing for people to then show their funders or go elsewhere and just show this is what we're doing, So it was like a profile piece that was meant to sort of look at independent media and smaller news outlets that, were innovating, and they weren't necessarily. I wouldn't say it was easier for them in a way, because yeah, they were more agile and they were smaller in a way, but there was still a lot of challenges with resources. And in Oko Press's case, I think they had a lot of reporters who had never covered a major crisis like that. Some of them were born in like the 90s and hadn't seen before the wall fell and stuff. So they had never been in a position to cover some major crisis. So the older journalists were having to teach the younger journalists about what it was like to cover this.
When you were speaking also about that project from Greece, the Solomon magazine, I wanted to ask about their success in crowdfunding and a possible development of their media.
Yeah, so they just launched a Kickstarter campaign. It just ended about a week ago or so, and I know they met their target. I'm pretty sure it was like, I want to say off the top of my head, I think it was around 15 grand, 15,000, and they met their target. They might have even gone over that. So they had a success, but it has been a struggle for them, and they had to let go of so many people, and they had to really just rely on, talk about shoestring budgets. I know they get funding from the Open Society, and they've launched a membership campaign. So that membership campaign where you can contribute regularly is supposed to really help them try and get on their feet and still tell these untold stories, really.
Another question from Freelance Journalism Assembly. What would be the 3 tips must do you would give to the news organizations that are trying to reinvent themselves?
Yeah, I would say put audience first. That is essential. Like going after the ad sales, it's really unpredictable, and you can't rely on that. And it also, at the end, it will compromise you. So I think reader funded, if you can, like if you could have 80% reader funded, 20% ad sales budget, that would really be a much better way to go about it. Yeah, I mean, putting your reader first and trying to think, what do they want? And I think another thing that I saw that I'm sure Pierre might be talking about after this, because we interviewed them as well. Reader surveys are really a great way to get that insight, to figure out what people want. And the Local also did that. They did a lot of reader surveys. So if you want that insight, ask your audience and don't be afraid to get that feedback. And finally, I would say, try and tell the stories that other people aren't telling, especially if you're like an independent outlet with a limited budget, and Solomon is a great example of that. No one else really has that insight because it's founded by a refugee or a migrant, and they also have connections with these people, and they're also contributing from a content perspective too. Like that's the untold story. So I think that that's not that easy to develop, but if you can partner with other organizations that have that connection with those vulnerable and underreported groups, I think that is key. And that is a theme we saw throughout the underreported, the people who were forgotten largely by mainstream press.
Thank you. We have another question for you from Andrea Abelan. Great work. I follow your podcast, Conversations with Data. I wonder, how did your work on this series was influenced by the pandemic?
You mean, how was data journalism? Okay. Yeah. So
your work, your podcast.
Oh, right. Okay. So basically during the pandemic, just before we had launched a podcast called Conversations with Data, which was based on the newsletter. And we immediately just realized we were going to have to cover COVID. So we started interviewing a scientist who mainly spoke about, what COVID was. She really stomped out a lot of misinformation about the virus. Yeah, we really had to run a lot of different articles as well about, COVID, about underreported groups and how to use data as a way to tell stories about these people. We also looked at Black Lives Matter. That wasn't necessarily with the podcast, but that was online. But yeah, it was basically, we were interviewing experts and we were trying to find out the facts and also the insights and what the data meant and what we didn't know and what we did know. So I think that, yeah, it definitely was it was a moment for data journalists, this pandemic, because it was so data fueled and heavy, and it still is, so.
And since I know you really like to do this podcast, how do you plan to extend your work?
Well, we're going to, like, for instance, we're focusing on vaccines next. So we've interviewed a woman from the Heidi, she's from the Vaccine Confidence Project, and she's going to be talking about misinformation and vaccines and how really we need to get it right. And we need to, really just debunk a lot of misinformation that's coming out about vaccines and the fear around that. So that's one way we're doing it. And yeah, we're just trying to stay in touch with what's happening now. And yeah, and for the resilience reports, which I talked about, we'll have a final report out looking at the summary of the findings and the recommendations in the next month or so, I imagine. So.
How do you think the situation with the media and especially the impact of some COVID-relation issues like the loss of advertisers and other stuff will influence the journalism in the future year?
I think that what we're seeing is a lot of people are realizing they've got to go reader funded. They've got to put membership and subscription models in place that really put the audience first. And we need to stop relying so much on advertising because it does compromise you editorially in some ways. And it does make it difficult because it's so unpredictable. So I think we're going to see a shift where people are really hiring membership people. Membership is becoming, it's much more, you're a part of the process, and you're no longer just someone who's reading. You're not a subscriber, you're a part of this publication in some way. So I think, bringing readers into the editorial process, that's something that we're going to see. But yeah, people are realizing that the advertising, it's unsustainable, and it doesn't produce good, interesting content. And I think we need to be steering clear of that, especially if you're an independent organization and you want to put your readers first.
We were speaking about also the relationship between the journalists and their audience, and about the trust the audience has in the media, and its comparison also to the government and their trust into the government. And do you think this will also somehow change after the COVID pandemics? Could it influence also this kind of trust between people and government and people and media?
I think one thing we did see throughout all the different people, all the different organizations we interviewed, was the notion of public service journalism, where you're really providing life-saving information to your audience that they need now, that will affect their lives, that could affect their livelihoods, it could affect, whether they get the virus or not. So I think we're going to see more people. I think this was our moment where we proved as professional journalists that we mattered, and that the information we were sharing and the facts we were sharing and the misinformation we were debunking. This was our moment to prove we actually we matter, and also we deserve to be paid for this. So I think we will see more of that public service journalism come out, and I think we need to use this moment to remind people trust matters and verification matters, and we're here to do that. And sometimes journalists make mistakes. If that is the case, we need to be transparent about it, and we need to come forward. And that is one way, bringing journalists in, or the audience in, and making them understand how the news media works, what editorial processes come into play, how do you come up with story ideas, and also be a part of that. So that's how we bring in trust, I think, is being transparent and just providing information that is going to, that people need and that is necessary. And we have to remind our audience that we matter, basically.
I think it was the great conclusion sentence that we really matter, and I hope that it will be something that will prove in the future that really the independent media are something that matters. So I hope that we will manage to persuade our audience and also other people that we are very good in our work. And I wish you a good luck with your further writing, and especially the podcast. And I hope that you will extend it to the level you even want to be. And I thank you very much for coming, at least in this online version, to Prague, and hope to see you next year here.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye.
And within 5 minutes, we will start another session with Pierre Leibovitz. Thank you very much.